Death changes everything. When my father died 10 years ago, I not only had to deal with my own grief, I also had to navigate my way through the many practical consequences of his death. I was the executor of his estate, so almost every week I had to travel to Philadelphia, where my family lives, to manage the estate's affairs. My mother was in the early stages of dementia, so my two sisters and brother and I had to move her into a life care facility, as well as to manage her finances and her health care. And when my siblings and I realized that we no longer had Dad to referee our relationships, we had to figure out how to work together, how to be upfront and honest with each other, as well as how to hold family conferences to agree on my mother's care. Death changes everything. In today's gospel, Luke tells us the story of a funeral in the city of Nain. He begins with a very simple description. He tells us, as Jesus drew near the gate of the city, a man who had died was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow. In that simple description, Luke tells us many things. To be sure, the mother is grief-stricken, as any mother would be in experiencing the most unthinkable nightmare of any parent, the loss of a child. But Luke also tells us that the mother is a widow, and that this child was her only son. And those two facts are critical to understanding the story. You see, in the ancient world, women were dependent on male relatives for support. And so it was important for women to be married so that their husbands could support them. And it was important for them to have sons so that their sons could support them once their husbands died. In the case of the widow of Nain, she no longer had either a husband or a son. She could only hope that maybe a male relative from her extended family would take her in, perhaps a brother or a brother-in-law, an uncle or a male cousin. But times were tough, and there was no guarantee that extended family members could afford to support others beyond their own immediate family. Without that support, the widow would be facing dire straits. Now, Jesus was no stranger to the realities of his time. Did you ever wonder why he gave his mother, Mary, to the beloved disciple at the foot of the cross? It's because he knew that after his death, someone would have to take care of his mother. And how many people in our own lives, in our families, in our neighborhoods, even in our church, are like Mary or the widow of Nain? So many people struggle in today's economy, finding it hard to pay the bills, having to choose between paying the rent or the electric or the telephone, figuring out how to squeeze the grocery bill somewhere in between. We see folks like that all the time at our rectory food pantry. And it's satisfying to know that we can help relieve some of the pressure on them, if only just a little. And how many of us have had to take someone into our own homes to help them through a tough time? Maybe they lost their jobs, or split up with a partner, or were evicted from their homes. And it's a blessing that we can help them get back on their feet. But how many folks don't have that option? Don't have any family members or friends that are able or willing to take them in? More people today are like the widow in our gospel story than we might realize. And thank God that Jesus understands their plight. St. Luke tells us that when the Lord saw the widow of Nain, he was moved with pity for her, and he said to her, "Do not weep." Perhaps he had already speculated about what would happen to his own mother when he himself would die. So that in raising the young man to life, Jesus was not only giving the son an opportunity to live, he was ensuring that the mother would have an opportunity to live as well. As Luke tells us, the dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. This story is as much about the widow as it is about the son. And it's about Jesus' love and compassion for those who struggle. Unlike many miracle stories, no one in this story asks Jesus to act in this situation. Jesus acts on his own initiative. And no one's faith is necessary for the miracle to occur. There's no indication that the widow or the son or anyone else in the city had any faith in Jesus or even knew who he was. The story of the widow of Nain is the story of how God comes to us in our need. It's a story of how God knows our needs and takes care of them without our even asking. Because God doesn't wait to be asked. It's a story of God's grace and generosity through the person of Jesus Christ. Because God doesn't require anything of us but to be in need. And God's love will take care of the rest. And that is the source of our hope. Because we can bring our deepest hurts and our greatest struggles to the Lord, and he can heal them. When we've tried every which way to solve our problems, when we've reached out to others, when we've come to the end of our rope, we can depend that Jesus sees us in our need and, moved with compassion, says to us, "Do not weep." We can know that when we've run into all the dead ends, Jesus comes to bring new hope, new opportunity, and new life. When we talk about grace, that's exactly what we're talking about. Grace is God's generous gift of himself, offered to us without our deserving it, given to us without our asking for it. When we talk about a gracious God, we are talking about the God of Jesus Christ, who recognizes our needs and addresses them with initiative and generosity. And that grace is the source of our hope. Hope is God's presence and power to sustain us in our lives, so that no matter what we face, we know that there is nothing that we and God can't handle together. When we talk about a God of hope, we're talking about the God of Jesus Christ, who intervenes for us without even demanding faith, who offers us life for tomorrow because of his presence to us today. Death changes everything. Whether it be the death of a loved one, or the death of a relationship, or the death of our own security and opportunity. Death changes everything. And so often, death brings us to the end of our rope and causes us to grieve and despair. But God, our God, is a God of grace and hope. A God who sends Jesus Christ to join us in our journey without our even asking. A God who sends Jesus Christ to bring us life, even in the face of death. Amen.